Live with another weekly privacy chat. Thanks to all of you who've been following and joining all along. Not, I think, live the last 2 weeks. Life interferes, but I think we're back in the saddle and delighted to be back with an old friend. He doesn't look old, but we go back a long time, Keith Enright. Keith, I think it was even before you went to Macy's that we connected, right? You were consulting? Was it IBM? Where were you right before Macy's that I think you and I crossed paths in the early days of privacy?
Yeah, so right before Macy's with Limited Brands, before that was IBM, but you and I actually go back even further than that, all the way back to when I was GC of AdKnowledge.
Ah, that's right. I had totally forgotten. You actually started out in the ad tech swamp like I did. So I always tell people that the basics of just understanding ad tech, but not just understanding the technology of the flows and the tracking and the pixels, but why marketers use data, the need for analytics and reporting has been super useful, like for my entire career, right? I mean, whatever sector we're talking about, you kind of need to understand why and how businesses reach people and why they want and what they need. Is that a fair? I argue all the young people start out by understanding the marketing and advertising world. If you're just on the other side, sort of like, oh, look at the dumb things that are happening with pixels, how stupid. Why don't people just stop doing that? You don't, I think, fully appreciate and understand industry. Has that been a sort of secret weapon of yours as well throughout the years?
It's so funny. We don't talk about this enough. That is so fundamentally true. Before I went to AdKnowledge, I was a privacy zealot and advocate, but I was very lopsided. I didn't realize how asymmetrical my understanding of the space was and my values. When I went to AdKnowledge, I was working for a really young, brilliant entrepreneur, a guy named Scott Lynn. And we had these great conversations where he forced me to think about the jobs we were creating, the businesses that we were enabling, the value we were generating, and the fact that we were helping a huge number of people to do those things responsibly and to stay on the right side of history. So it helped me outgrow the presumptive distaste I had for advertising and recognize that ad tech can help a whole bunch of businesses that we really value and really want to see flourish. And getting smart and thoughtful and privacy focused people into ad tech allows us to do those things in sort of a societally beneficial way.
Well, you mentioned jobs created, and I guess one frustration I've had over the years, and we have maybe a little bit more leeway to sort of talk credibly about these things. When technology advances, and when we want to regulate it and put safeguards around it, there are a whole bunch of equities that really matter, right? And quote unquote privacy is one. There's competition, there's the economic activity, there's the research, there's social good, there's what impact it'll have on other participants, there's fraud, there's transparency, there's this whole range of important social factors. But very often, if I'm talking to a data protection authority, their prism is a very specific prism, and they are not the competition, regulator. They're not necessarily the ones worried about healthcare research. They're not worried about the economy. But on the other hand, they are supposed to be. If you're trying to assess legitimate interests, what is necessary, what is reasonable, you kind of need to have some deeper understanding of those other disciplines. And what's been your perspective, certainly during your time? When you come in and you're wearing your industry hat, whether it was Google days or others, the critic who you're sitting with said, well, of course they're going to be arguing, all these other values, but it can be frustrating sometimes because that stakeholder's job is not to understand those values and bring them into the equation, or even if it is, they may not have the depth and the expertise in those other areas, but the people who do have the credible voice in those areas are not in the room. It's, when big tech company A says, well, we need the data because we care about healthcare, the healthcare researcher, isn't there in the room explaining they've got other fish to fry. They're busy with what they're worried about. I'd love your sort of perspective, given that you had to make that argument, but again, you were making it from the point of view of, well, here's my company, needs this data.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting thing to talk about. My experience closely mirrors what you were just describing. I think the best and most effective regulators were both sophisticated enough and calibrated enough to recognize that there were multidisciplinary consequences, sort of intersectional dependencies when they were making tech policy, even if they were presumably operating in the context of data protection. But even great regulators who were trying to do the right thing, they live in a political dynamic that constrains their behavior a lot. One of the examples that very widely reported on that I spent a lot of time talking about was Google's effort to implement the privacy sandbox, to allow Chrome to maintain or move into the sort of a leading position on privacy vis-a-vis other competing browsers. They were dealing with two separate forces that were coming at them at a high volume and velocity. On the one side, you had privacy regulators and privacy advocates saying Google had acknowledged that third-party cookies were a privacy problem to be solved. And on the other side, you had competition authorities and other players in the industry saying cookies were an essential dependency upon which a vibrant commercial ecosystem depended. Those two realities collided between the ICO and the CMA, two good agencies trying to advance thoughtful policy, but it basically created a stasis situation that disabled Google's ability to execute. They couldn't do the thing that they believed, and I think almost everybody believed, was going to improve privacy online and improve the state of ad tech, because they were being constrained by adjacent concerns around what those moves might do to the competitive ecosystem.
Yet, when there's a bigger dynamic, sometimes that narrative shifts. And my example is the Google search competition trial, where, if you recall, I became the chief privacy officer because of the AOL search data issue. And what are their response? Let's have a chief privacy officer. He'll make sure it doesn't happen again. But when we looked at the search data that the researchers still wanted, some of them were privacy researchers, and they were like, okay, well, this time we'll really de-identify it. We found that for the complexity of search data, highly dimensional, giant long tail, you never know what's going to be in there to even be able to sort of do a smart assessment of, well, here are the likely indirect identifiers. You just don't know what's going to be entered into the search box. Enormously hard problem. The privacy community has not been up in arms the way you would imagine because of this bigger, well, let's support the DOJ's effort to, break up Google or force the licensing of search data. Any of the serious privacy arguments have been dismissed as sort of, well, that's really just a fig leaf, right? And so it is sort of interesting how, at the end of the day, it's sometimes not even about privacy, right? It's about power and the bigger political dynamic. All right, let's pivot. And here's our pivot point. AI seems to be the first time that some of the data protection regulators who think most ad tech is illegal, who think a lot of the social media activity, is too risky and is presumed to be illegal, are taking a look at AI and are suddenly saying, we kind of think this is illegal. Like, how did all that data get scraped? Where did it come from? It's sensitive. What legal basis? And they're suddenly saying, wait a second, we need to be pragmatic. The benefit is so consequential. Here are the various means that we could be flexible. Maybe you can't delete the data, but okay, we'll tolerate the state of unlearning and simply suppress it or use pets and so forth. And I'm not arguing that's a bad thing, but it does seem like we are at this, dramatic, moment. Is that the reason why? Because if I were you, I left a long career. I was in the corporate world for a while. I did well. I might either be on a beach or maybe doing something not for profit, or maybe I'd be doing some boards and some consulting, picking and choosing a few interesting clients. But not necessarily in a very competitive, pressure cooking environment of a large law firm. And Gibson is a phenomenal place with great people, but it is certainly getting from one incredibly stressed treadmill to a different, but still high pressure, high pace, high demand, high hours. So why be the a lead of the AI practice and the tech practice at a giant global high pressure, big stakes, big cases place like Gibson?
It is such a fun question to think through, in part because like I am so immensely grateful for the way things have played out. I joined Google in 2011. I thought I was joining, I was joining a company with the intention that I was going to be part of the team making, organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible and useful, right? Like I drank deeply of the Kool-Aid and just had this unbelievable ride with them. And I have genuine love, like an affection for the company that will never go away. For the last 3 to 5 years, it was a huge company, right? Like I was working for a company in the order of 200,000 employees, massively diverse businesses, all of the challenges and changes that go along with something like that. I did have the incredible good fortune to be invited to join a private company's board of directors. We went through an IPO. That company became a public company. So I was exposed to a earlier stage founder-led company with a totally different risk appetite, with a different view of the world, a different kind of pragmatism. And that reminded me how Google shaped my perspective had become, sort of how comfortable, as big and as incredibly challenging as the role at Google was, it was still very Google shaped. It was still very Google calibrated. So suddenly to be exposed to a wildly different perspective on the way the world was evolving and the opportunity, the business opportunity, the technological opportunity, that had me thinking about what I wanted to do next. When I stepped away, I looked at all the things you sort of described. I would say I had a very strong presumption I would go and be GC or CLO at some AI startup. I'm obsessed with artificial intelligence. That'll become clear through the rest of our conversation. Like all the things that drew me to privacy 25 years ago are now manifesting in a dramatically more intense way in the context of artificial intelligence. So I knew that I wanted to be close to AI. I presumed I would go into a startup. There was a possibility I would go into a VC or something like that to get exposed to a large portfolio of companies. I had a bunch of those conversations, thought that was where I was headed. And then a good mutual friend of ours, Jane Horvath, reached out to me and it said, you need to have a conversation with these Gibson folks. Like something special is happening over here. Last thing in the world I imagined was that I would go to a large law firm, but largely as a courtesy to Jane, I had a couple of conversations, and the way that went down, I had a conversation with Barbara Becker, who was the chair of the firm, who made it incredibly clear to me, we want to build a destination practice for all of the existential issues that are going to face our clients for the next decade. So they were taking a much longer view than I thought a big law firm would be capable of taking. Next few conversations were people like Ashley Behringer, who you probably also know, who had been deputy GC over at Meta. So me, Jane, and Ashley started coming into focus. This is a place that is bringing in people who have actually lived through these issues in a senior executive role at a world-changing tech-forward company. That was not something that I imagined would exist in a large law firm. And then one of the things that cinched it for me, probably my third or fourth conversation with Gibson, was a guy named Robert Spano, who was the former president of the European Court of Human Rights, who was also being offered up as the co-chair of the artificial intelligence practice with me here. And that, all of these things coming together, I was like, wait a minute, I am going to be at a law firm. I do think law firms are facing existential disruption over the next 5 years. It's another conversation, but like that'll be a really interesting place to be, to watch the way a 135-year-old law firm makes itself resilient to the incredible challenges that are coming. And then the concentration of incredibly talented senior execs from tech. And then finally, the fact that they had the prescience to take one of the world's leading jurists on human rights from a European perspective and say, we're going to make this person available to our tech clients and our multinational clients to help them understand the trajectory of the law, where it's headed, how it's going to evolve. I was like, I can't possibly not do this. It was just such a unique opportunity.
Well, let's try to understand for a minute what it is to counsel on AI. A lot of our members at the Future Privacy Forum are chief privacy officers, and well, a lot of them suddenly have and AI something, and AI governance, and AI risk. And clearly there's a lot of AI risk that is data protection risk. Where did you scrape the data from, and are you using it? Is it personal rights to delete? I mean, GDPR and state privacy laws are probably the actual lead regulators of AI today, perhaps. Curious if you agree with that, because before you even get to AI moratoriums or state AI laws, a significant amount of this is personal information, or might be personal information. And it was the Garante that said, stop to open AI. And this is even before we get into the world of AI regulation. But how much of AI counseling is simply sophisticated data protection governance, automated decisions, profiling, all of these things which we've always thought about as, big data, and okay, it's on steroids and it's a bigger deal. And how much of it is something new? I look at the job postings and I talk to some of the AI governance people who seem to have nothing to do with the data protection world, and they're talking about systemic risk. And I go to some AI governance conferences, and it feels like it's two very different worlds. One, a little bit more technologist-driven, red teaming, and then this whole world of sort of privacy, legal risk type people. How did you bridge that? And can you sort of describe, how much of what you do would I recognize as, well, that's sophisticated data protection, and how much of it is, this is new, this is, I don't know, it's IP, it's systemic risk, it's something else?
So you ask great and challenging questions, Jules. Let me sort of take that apart, because I think there are probably a half dozen different questions in there that warrant extraction. At the front end, I would say an interesting thing has happened over the last 5 years. You and I have been on the privacy journey for 25 years together. When you go all the way back, you remember, like, it was the Wild West. There was no law. We were trying to figure it all out. And privacy was, with a couple of fits and starts, it was largely just this sort of consistent journey up and to the right for those 2 decades. And we had some major inflection points like the GDPR, which suddenly elevated it to more of a board level issue, drove a ton of investment, and you had a lot more sophistication and professionalization of people working in privacy. One of the things that I thought was so interesting over the last 5 years, few things have happened. In post 2018, I think a lot of industry outside of privacy professionals were waiting for those giant existential disruptions to come from the GDPR, right? Because boards had been so hammered and inundated with signals that they needed to make these massive investments in privacy compliance and GDPR compliance. They were waiting to see some companies get rocked. And there was, I think, a general collective sense that just didn't happen, right? So that accelerated issue fatigue in a lot of organizations, where everyone recognized they now had new steady state compliance obligations, but the prominence of privacy and data protection as a boardroom consideration began to erode post 2019, 2020. I think there was a growing sense these teams had been overbuilt, overfunded. They were drawing too much attention away from other potential regulatory risks, things like child protection, competition, content regulation, lots of other things that seemed very, very important. So that was already happening. And then you had sort of the AI rocket fuel poured onto that conversation, where the launch of LLMs, major breakthroughs, and this growing sense for the last few years that everything was going to be about AI, and that AI was going to stress test the law. It was going to cause tectonic shifts in business models, massive economic dislocation. As all of that was playing out, you had leadership teams that were on the one hand thinking privacy is probably overfunded. We've probably overestimated the risk there. We have this new extraordinarily difficult area to get our arms around. And we are trying to figure out, how do we staff it? What talent do we have to help us understand that risk and manage it down? And I looked at the features of it, like it's about rapid technological innovation. It's about data, presumably. Like it looked, if you squinted a little, like it had many of the same features that data protection had before. So logically, and a lot of CPOs and senior privacy people were feeling the decline of their internal relevance. So they raised their hands and started shouting, I'm an AI person, right? And we saw a lot of that happening. We even see like the IAPP adjust its focus to sort of expand its remit to really focus on AI governance as well. So all of that was happening. The bit that I don't think is fully appreciated, that I think is really important that we keep an eye on, is those challenges and that evolution. It wasn't just a private sector phenomenon, right? As you had kind of alluded, regulators themselves were going through the same thing. You had some regulators that had been taking political heat for not enforcing aggressively enough. You had sort of the slow, protracted process of things working their way through legal challenges and appeals and everything else. So regulators themselves were thinking, am I an AI regulator now? How much of my already underfunded mandate should I be just reallocating to focus on AI? How's the AI Act going to play out? What's my role going to be under the AI Act? What that did, from my view, is it slowed down, it reduced the amount of regulatory capacity to do high profile, highly complex enforcement investigations under laws like the GDPR. So we actually saw a contraction of perceived risk. Already, it seemed to validate and amplify the sense that privacy was a solved problem. Here's where I think things get really interesting. The GDPR hasn't gone away. Like that, none of that legal exposure has gone away. And all of these regulators are going to sort out their remits over the next couple of years. There will be new AI regulators that will establish themselves. Some data protection regulators will also step into this space. As all that sorts, I suspect what we're going to see, and I think this is going to be over the next few years, many of these data protection regulators are going to return to their enabling statutes and in part to just reassert their own relevance so that they remind people that they should continue to be funded. They are going to launch the most aggressive and impactful wave of data protection enforcement that we've ever seen. I think we've been in the eye of the storm. That's sort of a really good metaphor. People are misperceiving this as the new normal, that privacy is no longer the disruptive legal risk. I think it's going to come back. I think there's all sorts of political complexities to how and when it's going to happen, but I do think it's going to happen. So I think soon we're going to see both things happen.
But let me intersect something with that theory, because I fully agree. But here's this take that I have that maybe conflicts a bit with that. I don't know that I would say that they think privacy is a solved problem. I'd say they think it's a regulated problem. And when things are regulated, well, lawyers and legal departments handle those things. You don't need this drama of chief trust officer, chief privacy officer. There are a lot of state laws. There's a GDPR. Okay, legal people tell you what to do. And do you really need someone divining where it's going to go? What are the advocates going to say? What's the broader perspective sort of around it, that we need operational people training? I mean, all the things that sort of privacy teams that exist outside the legal infrastructure. So in companies where I see the CPO role go away, the work on privacy didn't go away. It got rolled into the privacy department. And I don't like people using sort of Google or Apple as examples, because you're not really representative of, the typical bigger resources, bigger risks, all kinds of different, but say Pfizer had a chief privacy officer. They don't. The work didn't go away. There's a legal privacy lead. A lot of the banks, there are dozens of areas where we've sort of seen a diminution of the role, and where AI seems to be sort of, inflating, but, filling the importance of, we need someone who knows how to navigate the vibe, the advocates, the academic report, the this, to that. But I'd argue that today, the deregulatory take on AI, the FTC would like you to win against China as opposed to be accused of surveillance AI work. The administration will pushback at European regulators feels like it has taken a little bit of the energy out of the we need lots of people helping us with AI regulation. The White House is working on its AI policy. Evidently, a big part of it is going to be make sure your AI is not too woke, not make sure it's not doing discriminatory things. Love your reaction to sort of.
I couldn't agree more strongly with everything you said. I don't think we are in tension at all. The one sort of experiential point I would make is I would say politics is cyclical, right? Like we are in a moment right now, we'll be in a different moment, presumably X number of years from now, and we will see appetite for enforcement and calibration change. We are definitely, and you mentioned it earlier, globally, there is the strongest sense I've ever felt in my career that regulators and policymakers are straight up afraid that they will over-regulate in a way that impairs innovation within their market, which will create a massive lasting economic disadvantage or potentially even a military, potentially even existential disadvantage. So, and those arguments have always been there, but they appear to be more powerful right now in shaping and driving policy. But I will say, we talked before about AI. I don't think the notion of like an AI practice is going to age very well, right? Like that's like having an electricity practice. Like AI is going to be a catalyst for change in every area of the law, in every area of business, every area of technology. What I do think we will see play out over the next several years is going to be as businesses begin to sort of broaden and gain a more sophisticated understanding of how the legal threat landscape is evolving in light of the, I think, unprecedented AI-driven disruption that's coming. When I talk to GCs at large multinational companies today, none of them are saying we are less committed to managing down legal risk. We are less committed, even internally, even in a privileged conversation. What the signal is we are having a very hard time penetrating the uncertainty and figuring out where are the big legal risks. Because as you said, there is a very strong sense right now that the greatest risk vector facing most businesses is no longer privacy. It's no longer international data transfers. It appears to be some hybrid of our executive leadership team is telling us we need to move quickly to embrace these technologies, or we are going to be innovated out of existence. We will be left behind and a competitor will disrupt us. However, we don't want to adopt these technologies in a way that exposes us to intellectual property liability or content regulation liability. We don't want to do something that exposes our brand to something like a public-facing chatbot spewing hate speech, right? Like, and they are looking for guidance. In some ways, it's like being a CPO 10 years ago, but it's even faster and even more complicated because it requires an even broader domain expertise, a kind of intellectual fluidity where you can know enough about intellectual property that you can issue spot and then pull in the right expert, know enough about content regulation, know enough about employment and labor law. You really do need to be miles wide to be able to help a client really figure out, we have a finite amount of attention. What things should we be looking at so that we can proceed responsibly and allocate our compliance resources in a way that allows us to survive the window of uncertainty and be positioned to compete successfully 3 years from now, 5 years from now?
Things go around and around. At AOL, before I was chief privacy officer, I was vice president for integrity assurance. And it was the range of product issues that might be raised by the fact that we had instant messaging and we had chatbots and we had content and we had kids and we had this whole bucket of issues. So just as the internet sort of forced these interdisciplinary lawyers who were internet lawyers or tech lawyers to have this sort of broader product counseling scope in many ways. All right, in the very tight time we've got left, what are the power tools that you find most useful? Our friend Noga Rosenthal did an interesting piece about how, as a GC, she sees the future of the junior lawyers like, well, she doesn't use them anymore for the kind of work, and now she's worried about how to develop them and so on and so forth. What are you finding your power tools for your day-to-day legal work?
It's such a great question. I just went for a long walk with some of our summer associates and had a conversation around like what they should be doing now, given the uncertainty of the development of the legal profession. And the superpower right now, the power tool, is intellectual curiosity, right? Like it is figuring out how do you protect somewhere between 10 and 20% of your overall bandwidth to experiment and play and use ChatGPT, use Gemini, use Claude, use Harvey, use all of these tools. Think about things like how companies like Reality Defender are helping to identify deepfakes and what does that mean for legal practice. Look at the way the time tracking space is evolving. Like there is so much innovation happening right now, and all lawyers, I think lawyers at the beginning of their career will be very, very well advised to be able to demonstrate that they can distinguish themselves from their cohort by being the most versatile, the most fluid, to be able to scale up using all of these new superpowers of technology that are becoming available to them. And your senior folks right now really flexing the muscle to recognize that like adaptability, you are not going to be doing the same things in the same ways you always have before. You're not going to be utilizing entry-level associates in the same way that you were before. And we're going to have to think about new ways to mentor talent. We're going to have to do something to figure out how do we preserve a talent pipeline so that we have super sophisticated advisors 10 years from now when the people entering the workforce aren't going to look a whole lot like the people that have been doing it for the last 50 years.
Final question. What are you, I find that a lot of the people in kind of the legal and privacy community, they know how to read what they know. They read our newsletters, the IPP newsletters, the legal blogs, da, 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 da. And when I say to them, well, which kind of business or tech publications do you follow closely? They may not be following those. It's not part of their day-to-day. And I say, well, I don't know, Ben Evans or Casey Newton and Platformer, or these sort of technologists that are kind of interested at the intersection. Do you, did Lindsay Finch, our friend at Salesforce, said, well, I coded some Salesforce agents, and that was a learning experience. Do you have a tidbit to leave us that here's something I did, or here's something I read that I really find helps me sort of understand where this is going, non-law policy?
Such a great question, and way too verbose an answer to be honest about it. Like I would say all of the major foundation model providers are releasing an incredible amount of content to help you understand how the technology works and where it's heading. So that's where I would start, because it's very high quality content. It's highly curated. And then from there, I would say LinkedIn is a great place to start. Like look for people. I try to share out stuff that I think is interesting. There are Ethan Mollick is a phenomenal, I think, resource for non-technical people who are trying to understand how AI is actually changing the way we work and live. So if I were to point to one person, he's probably the person I would point to as a starting point, but you can fall all the way down this rabbit hole. You're never going to hit the bottom of it. There is so much interesting stuff happening right now.
Awesome. Super. We don't have time to answer your questions, folks, because it's Friday and you should not be going back to work, but maybe cutting out early if you're on the East Coast. Keith, great to catch up. Look forward to continuing. I feel like we could talk about this for a long time, but hopefully we'll continue some of those conversations in person. So
always a pleasure, my friend. I'll look forward to the next one.
Good to see you. Enjoy the weekend.
See you, buddy.